Now I'm recording. And now I am also going to share my screen here. And there we go. Move this a little bit. Okay, excellent. So what we're going to do today for about the first half of this session is I've put together a little bit of information, well, a little bit more information than we've already given you in the web course that I think are some really sort of key takeaways in terms of grant writing. And so these just take you kind of a little bit through, if I can get the slides to work, just take you a little bit through the different phases of the grant writing process. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the relevant activities are at each of these different phases, some of the key questions to kind of ask yourself, and then also some key advice that we find really helpful. And we're also going to, in this first half, talk a little bit about just writing structure. And so I think that one of the most important things to keep in mind with respect to grant writing is that it's a very iterative process. You're not going to just sit down and start typing away on your computer and in an hour or two be completely done with your grant proposal. It really is a process that you sort of reiterate as you move through and refine your writing and the idea for the proposal as you go through, so that when you do get to the end of the process, you have a really nice, clear, very thoroughly thought through, well-written idea and proposal for the funding agency. It's also important to keep in mind that grant writing, I like to say, almost has a little bit of an art to it. There's no one size fits all approach to grant writing. And oftentimes, one of the biggest challenges with grant writing is, of course, finding funding opportunities that are relevant for your organization and for your mission and the programs that you have. And so to that end, I would say, check out the resources that we've provided you in the web course and the new link that we're providing you in an announcement. And read the grant opportunities with a little bit of an open mind and kind of a broader vision. It is going to be the case that, you know, it's unlikely you're going to run across a grant opportunity that just very squarely fits everything that you do and pursue as an organization. But what you're likely to find are funding opportunities that that maybe cover a part of what you do as an organization, or they present an opportunity for a little bit new or different application of the programs and services that you're already providing. And so, of course, I'm not suggesting that you pull away from your mission and you try to pretend to be someone, you know, as an organization that you're not. But sometimes there's just a little bit of a finesse that's involved with grant writing to be able to, again, identify potential sources of funding and grants, and then also to write your story and deliver your proposal in such way that's going to make the funder excited about giving the money to your organization, because they're going to feel very confident that the money is going to be put to good use. So that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about this morning. So again, just this overall perspective in terms of grant writing, I think it's really helpful to think about a grant proposal and grant writing in general as a way, again, as I said, as a way to clarify and refine your idea or your project through many iterations of putting your ideas down on paper so they get out of your head, but then refining all of that writing, revising it, proofreading it, letting someone else take a look at it. is really, really helpful to help just clarify and refine. And then also really to help you better articulate in writing what it is you want to do and why you want to do it. So these are the things to kind of keep in mind when you approach grant writing. So the way that we oftentimes think about the process of grant writing, and certainly there's a number of different ways that you can think about this, but I ran across this one source of information that presented the process of grant writing in a number of phases. And so I'm pulling from that information here because I really like the way that this is set up and described. And so in the first sort of phase, you're really trying to come up with just a basic summary of your idea and your proposal. So at the very beginning of any grant proposal or grant writing process, again, the first step, which is a very important step, is to get that idea out of your head and down onto paper. And so it doesn't have to be a 20 pages discussion of your program and all of the intricate details involved. You just need to be able to write a one paragraph summary of your idea that you're trying to find some grant funding for. And so some of the most important questions to ask yourself right in the very beginning in this first summary phase is simply, what exactly is it that you want to do? And who is the target or the intended audience that you want to deliver this program or this service to? And these are important questions because the funding agency, above all else, wants to know very specifically what you would do with the money and who's going to benefit most from it. They're interested in using their money most effectively and most efficiently, and it's your job to convince them through your proposal that you're the one to do that. So, use your tools of persuasion, make sure that your idea is really flushed out and it's not something that you just came up with off the top of your head. You want to really make sure that you're sending a very clear message and convincing the grantors that their money is going to be going to a good place and that the outcomes of awarding that grant is going to be beneficial for everyone involved. In the second phase, this is where you need to do your research. So, of course, the first step is to do some research to be able to find some grants that fit your idea. And once you have that paragraph, right, or sometimes it's referred to as an aims page. And an aims page is simply a summary of your idea, right, and specifies specifically the goals that you have in pursuing that idea. So once you have that sort of simplified description of your project or your program, it makes it much easier for you to ask others to read that short paragraph or that one-page description and ask them if they know of any other funding sources. Again, you may not find a source of grant funding that fits your idea 100%, but you might be able to find one that is tangentially related to your idea, and you can kind of mold your idea to fit the goals and objectives of that agency and that grant program. These days, of course, there's a ton of great online resources for grant funding, but I also want to mention, maybe not quite right now in this particular time, but don't ignore your public libraries. Public libraries are great sources of information, and librarians are very much trained in trying to seek grant sources and other resources that might be really helpful for you. So using your public libraries might be a nice approach if going online to grants.gov or some of the other foundation sites feels a little bit overwhelming at first. And so in this second research phase, you're really trying to seek advice here about whether your project might even be considered by a potential funder. And so it's really important to ask yourself who you already know in the field. Do you know someone that works for a foundation or another granting agency? It's very common practice, actually, to reach out to potential funders and ask them about your project because they want their grant funding processes to be as efficient and as fluid as possible. They usually will be very happy to review a short paragraph or an email that describes your project and give you a very basic assessment of whether or not it's something that their agency would be willing to consider at this time. And so even for university professors or graduate students who are applying for large dollar grants from the National Science Foundation, even in this context, it's very common to reach out to a program manager or program director. And again, just ask them if they're interested in your idea. I think much of the time what you'll find is that these individuals who have to make these very difficult decisions about which programs and projects to fund among a lot of excellent ideas, they don't want their time to be wasted either. And so they're usually really willing to just tell you outright, this just isn't the direction that we're going right now. Or yeah, this is absolutely, we see the value in this, put together a full proposal. And so you will also, one last thing on this slide that I want to mention, you will also oftentimes, particularly for foundation grants, they will oftentimes ask for a letter of intent to begin with. And a letter of intent is essentially what I'm talking about right here, right? It's a general description of your idea, who your target audience is, what your major goals are to accomplish with this project or program. And then based on that short description, they will then make decisions about who they plan to invite to submit full proposals. So again, a letter of intent is a really, really nice way to kind of get your foot into the door of a foundation or other agency. So I wouldn't let that deter you if that is a first step requirement for any particular funding agency. In the next step, I have here preparation. And here, I cannot emphasize enough, read the application instructions. And when you're done reading the application instructions, read the instructions again. Anytime I've ever applied for a grant or I've looked at funding opportunities, there are very, very specific instructions involved. And the reason for that is because it's oftentimes very difficult to compare two proposals to each other because the ideas could be entirely different, the approaches could be very different. And so funding agencies will use the instructions or the call for proposals as a way to try to normalize all of the proposals and applications that they receive to make them a little bit more comparable. So funding agencies will very, very easily and very quickly reject your grant proposal if it doesn't follow the instructions. And by that, I mean, dot your I's, cross your T's, make sure if they say we need A, B, and C, that you tell them specifically for A that you're looking for, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're going to do for part B. Part C is this. You can use headings, boldface headings. Use the exact language from the RFP in writing your proposal, because the granting agency is describing to you, usually in pretty good detail, what it is that they want. And so part of your proposal needs to be a story that convinces them that you have what they want and you can deliver it in the best possible way. And so not following instructions is the easiest way to get your grant proposal rejected without even being given, real good consideration. So I absolutely cannot emphasize enough, double, triple, quadruple check to make sure that you've included everything that they're asking for, that in your written proposal that it discusses every aspect that they've asked for. And again, make it easy for them to find that information. Don't hide it from them. Have it pop out on the page and stand out for them. You want to make it as easy as possible for them to read and like your proposal. So once you've kind of prepared yourself and you know all of the elements that need to go into your proposal, that's when you start to generate the proposal itself. So again, this is going to be a process that goes through a few cycles of revisions as you sort of begin to generate, structure, and then edit and re-edit the written proposal. Here, when you're actually now generating the writing for the proposal itself, you want to begin with that paragraph that you started with, or that letter of intent, or that aims page, whatever you want to call it, whatever it is that you've put together. Start there, of course, right? And then gather together everything else that you acquired during the research phase. So any notes that you've taken, emails that you've exchanged with program directors, asking about the topic, and be as comprehensive as possible. But you need to be clear. You need to be very explicit about what makes your idea so great and compelling and likely to lead to success. That's crucial. So some of the most important questions to ask yourself in this phase of the grant writing process is, of course, what is your idea? Is it a good idea? How many parts are there to this idea? Who's going to care about it? Right? Who will this idea help? Who will this idea hurt? How will you be able to determine if your idea is a success? How will you measure the results of your activities to determine if they're successful? And of course, what that final product is going to be that you produce. And again, even within grant proposals, people love to look at pictures. They really make a strong statement. So using charts and graphs and even photos to illustrate your idea and really show the impact that you can make with this grant funding is a really, really helpful way to go about it. Still in this phase of structuring and writing your proposal, you want to make sure that as you're pulling all of these different pieces together of your notes, your original paragraph in writing, and you start to organize these different pieces of writing, you want to make sure that you start to create this logical flow for the reader. You may be sending your proposal to an individual who doesn't have the same expertise as you, or is not an expert in the idea that you're trying to sell to them, that you're trying to get funded. And so you have to be very explicit and clear in explaining your idea and what the goals are with your proposal, and then how you're going to measure those things. Again, the requirements of the grant or the call for proposals will generally tell you very specifically how your proposal should be structured. Follow those instructions. They want to see your proposal in their desired format because it makes it easier for them to compare and contrast among multiple proposals. And oftentimes these individuals that are reviewing grant proposals are doing a lot of them at a time. And so they may only spend 2 to 5 minutes looking at your proposal initially before they decide if it stays or if it goes. And so again, not following the instructions, or having just an idea that is outside of the scope of the agency and the funding program are kind of the two biggest ways for your proposal to get disregarded from the beginning. But they're also, as I'm describing to you, two of the biggest ways that you can also, if you do them correctly, right, you can help yourself to a great extent. And so overall, what you're trying to do here in phase 4 is to create a structure that kind of flows from a more general outline of the work that's going to be performed, which is your summary that you've created, and then starts to whittle down to the more specific details of how you plan to accomplish that work, which we call your methodology. So within this overall preparation of your proposal and trying to structure your writing a little bit more, I have here a few things that should help guide the structure that you're developing. So usually, and again, this is kind of a general structure that is helpful to follow, but again, needs to be adapted and tailored to the specific funding source that you're applying to. So your summary is usually the first part of the structured proposal, and your summary should really be a standalone paragraph or a couple paragraphs, and not necessarily referred back to in the rest of your proposal. So it could be like an executive summary or just an overall summary that someone can very quickly read and understand what it is that you're proposing and what you want to do. The background and motivation of your proposal is really important because it places your project within its proper context, and it tells the reader, the evaluator, why they should care about your project, what makes it important, why is it needed. So really trying to identify the demand in the community for your services or your program is extremely important, because you have to establish that a need exists in the community that you and only you can fulfill with this funded program. Generally, a grant application will also ask for a longer project description that will include some historical context. So again, this specific project discussion should really sort of naturally flow from that background and motivation section, and which is going to primarily talk about why your project is so needed. And then in your project description, you will tell the reader how much your project makes sense to do given the background, right, and the motivation that you've already discussed. And so what you're trying to do here is to really show the reader how you're going to solve this problem in your community, or at least contribute to achieving a solution to a problem that you've outlined in the background section. The next general section, and you have an entire PowerPoint, I believe, about this in the web course, is the methodology. And here, it doesn't have to be super complex. You don't necessarily have to talk about running a bunch of fancy statistics, although I personally like to do that and find that enjoyable. It really doesn't have to be too complex. You can definitely keep it simple. But what you need to do here is tell the reader exactly how you're going to approach the project. Make sure that you've got a clear outline of how your project is going to move from your idea at point A to your solution that you are proposing at point B. And this part is really, really important. A lot of projects are great ideas, and we'd love to do them. But thinking about them in terms of actual implementation and how to do that and how to reach the intended or target audience, and then how to follow up afterwards to make sure that your goals have been achieved. These are challenging things for any project. And so in this part of the grant proposal, it's not only sufficiently important to convince the reader that you have a really nice idea and that there's a need, but here in the methodology section, you really need to be able to convince the funding agency that you know how to reach that solution, and you're the best person equipped to do it. You may, for certain projects that are a little bit bigger, you may do a small part of a project and then sort of use that work to morph that into a larger grant proposal that kind of gets you a little bit further along, and so on and so forth. So you don't always have to have a novel idea and then find a $5 million grant to be able to pursue your idea, and then after the grant is done, be over and done with it. If you have a series of strategic goals that you want to pursue on a continual basis, you can certainly gather funding from a variety of different sources, and you can use grant funding to move the project along more incrementally. So for example, some colleagues and I in the spring before coronavirus hit, we had started doing some focus groups in the community because we're very interested in developing a financial literacy course for community residents surrounding the new UCF downtown campus. And so we were really grateful to be able to work with some partners in the community that we have and reach community members that way to conduct some focus groups, just to be able to identify, what the knowledge base is among these individuals. What do they know? What do they not know? What do they need to know? What do they want to know? Who they want that information from, and sort of what form they want that financial literacy information from. We felt was a very important first step to creating the program, because we didn't want to create a program that wasn't going to be useful for our intended and target audience. And so we had received a small grant to help fund that part of this larger project. And then since, unfortunately, because of COVID, we sort of had to pull back and stop the focus groups. And unfortunately, a couple of the foundation grant programs that we were planning to apply to have postponed their funding cycles this year because of COVID. But we still keep identifying various funding sources and tracking their due dates and their deadlines so that we can still continue to move this project forward, even though it's a little stalled right now because of the new world that we're all living in right now. So my point is, if you have any preliminary results like we do from these really important focus group discussions that we had with folks from the community, include that in your grant proposals. Funding agencies love to see that you've already done some work in this area and you've got some momentum going, and you're likely to be able to continue that momentum going into the future. That helps to ensure a greater likelihood of success. So absolutely, if you've already got, you know, some preliminary results that you can talk about, please feel free to include it in your proposal. And then, of course, the typical elements in terms of the overall structure. You want to have a project timeline and a project budget. And so usually the timeline is going to be your start date, your end date, and then kind of the dates of major tasks or deliverables that you have. And then your project budget, of course, you want to be specific. You want to be very clear about how much you need, how you're going to spend it. But here, another very, very important thing to keep in mind is that a lot of funding agencies will specify things they will and they will not pay for. And so you need to make sure that you're not proposing, you know, in the budget for, you know, travel out of state to a conference, when the funding agency will only cover the cost of travel in state, or something like that. Usually these things are very specific and include the maximum percentage of indirect costs or overhead costs that they are also willing to pay. So very important to keep in mind. And then editing. Oh my goodness. I don't send anything out into the world that has not been seen by probably 3 different people. Have another set of eyes, take a look at it. Proofread, proofread, proofread. Do this a few times. Sleep on it. Come back to it. Make sure that it's clear, it's concise, and that the flow is really well. If someone's reading your proposal, trying to evaluate it, and they don't understand what you're saying or what you're trying to propose that you're going to do, they're just going to get frustrated and give up. So really, this is important to make sure that the writing is really good and flows really well. Once you have all these parts kind of written, then you may need to, again, go back to the instructions and make sure, again, that you've got everything in the absolute proper format of what they've asked for. This is where your checklist of items that you need to include is absolutely crucial. And again, reread the instructions. Make sure that you're following them exactly. And then also you want to make sure that stylistically your proposal looks good as well. Certainly you don't want to take the smoke and mirrors approach of not having any content, but having a really nice, pretty looking proposal. You want to make sure that the content is there and it is solid and it is important. But at the same time, we are all visual consumers. And so you want to make sure that what you're submitting looks professional. It looks like you know what you're doing in putting this together. And so, you know, simple things like page numbers and numbering any tables and graphs that you might have in your proposal. Making sure that your font is consistent, that your line spacing and your paragraph spacing is consistent. These are little picky things, but for folks who read grant proposals like regularly, these are the things that just frustrate them and again make them just push your proposal to the side, because in their minds, if you can't even follow the simple instructions for a grant proposal, then how successful are you going to be in spending their money. That's kind of the way that a lot of individuals think when they're reviewing these things. So again, as I said, read the instructions again. Even when you think everything is ready to go back to your checklist, make sure you have everything, and then submit. And then unfortunately, the waiting part begins, which is the hardest part. But again, once you're sort of waiting for a decision to be made, you want to be respectful and give the funding agency the time that they indicated it would likely take for a decision to be made. But once that time passes, if you haven't heard anything from them, it is okay usually to contact them and inquire in a very nice, respectful, no pressure kind of way, because a lot of these grant proposals are submitted electronically, and things do sometimes get lost in these online systems. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm also going to stop recording now.